Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight we drift far back across the centuries into a land of oak forests and slow rivers, where the morning mist hangs low over fields that no Roman foot has yet trampled. You are standing somewhere in the green heart of ancient Gaul, what you would lazily call France today, and the air smells of wood smoke and wet earth. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a horn sounds low and mournful, and you feel it in your chest more than your ears. This is a free country for now, and you, my sleepy traveller, get to wander through it before the most famous conqueror in history decides he wants it for himself. Fair warning though, if you actually had to live here with the mud, the feuds, and the distinct lack of central heating, you probably would not survive your first winter. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, tell me down in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world, because I love imagining all of you drifting off at once. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin walking, and the land opens around you like a quilt stitched together by quarrelsome neighbours. Because here is the thing you need to understand about Gaul. It was never one country, not really, not in the way you picture a nation today with borders and a flag and a single grumpy ruler. It was a patchwork, a glorious, messy collection of perhaps 60 or more separate tribes, each with its own chief, its own gods, its own opinions about exactly how much it despised the tribe across the river. You pass the territory of one people, and within a day's walk, you are among another who speak a slightly different dialect, brew their beer a little stronger, and would happily raid your cattle given half a chance in a foggy night. You wander into a hill fort, what the Romans would later call an oppidum, and your jaw does that quiet drop of surprise. Because the lazy old story, the one passed down for centuries, was that these people were wild barbarians in face paint howling in the woods. But the truth standing in front of you is far more interesting. These are wooden townships, ringed by clever defensive walls built from timber, earth, and stone, laced together a technique so sturdy that Caesar himself would later grumble about how annoyingly fireproof and battering ram resistant it was. You see workshops where smiths hammer iron into blades and tools. You see merchants weighing out coins, actual minted coins of gold and silver, and you smell bread baking in communal ovens. The Gauls, it turns out, were skilled metalworkers, traders, and farmers who exported salted pork and fine craftsmanship across the known world. Not bad for people history tried to dismiss as savages. Here is your quirky little tidbit for the night, the kind of thing you can mumble to a friend tomorrow to sound impressive. The Gauls may well have invented something you use constantly, possibly while assembling furniture you swore you would never buy again. Many historians credit the Celtic peoples of this region with refining, if not outright inventing, the barrel, the wooden cask bound with hoops. The Mediterranean world stored its wine and oil in heavy clay jars that cracked if you so much as looked at them wrong, while these clever northerners were rolling sturdy reusable barrels around. Whiskey, wine, and your questionable home brew owe a quiet thank you to the people you are visiting tonight. They also allegedly gifted the world soap, or at least a soapy hair pomade, which means a Gaulish warrior may well have been better groomed than several Roman senators. You drift now toward a clearing where the trees grow thick and the light goes strange and dappled, and you feel the hair on your arms lift. This is a sacred grove, and at its center stand the druids, the priests, judges, teachers, and keepers of memory for these tribes. They wear no crowns and carry no swords, yet everyone defers to them because they hold the law, the calendar, the law of the gods, and the terrifying power to banish a man from all rituals, which in this society was a fate worse than a fistfight. The Druids taught entirely by memory, refusing to write their sacred knowledge down, which is wildly inconvenient for us today because it means almost everything they truly believed died with them, locked away forever. Historians still argue whether the darker tales of the Druids, the whispered stories of human sacrifice in Wicca, were genuine practice, or simply Roman propaganda invented to make conquest look like a public service. You lean towards skepticism because, let us be honest, an empire about to invade always has a wonderful reason why the locals desperately needed invading. As dusk settles, you sit at the edge of a longhouse, the fire crackling, and you listen to a bard sing of heroes and cattle raids and ancestors who turned into stags. You notice the warriors here are proud almost to a fault, fighting as much for personal glory and a good story as for any cause, leaping forward in single combat, boasting painting themselves with that blue woad dye, and occasionally fighting in nothing but their confidence and a talk around the neck. It is brave, it is theatrical. It is also, you realize, with a little wince, exactly the kind of disorganized, glory-hungry fighting that a cold, methodical professional army could one day exploit. These tribes are powerful alone but rarely act together, and their endless rivalries are a crack in the foundation, a hairline fracture that the right outsider could one day wedge wide open. And far to the south, beyond the mountains, in a marble city full of ambition and debt, that outsider is already looking northward, sharpening his quills and his legions, dreaming of the green land you have wandered tonight. But that, my friend, is a worry for tomorrow. For now the fire is warm, the bard sings on, and Gaul is still free. You leave the firelight of that Gaulish longhouse behind, and let the journey carry you south over the mountains, down into the sprawling, sun-baked chaos of Rome itself. Because to understand the storm coming for Gaul, you first need to meet the man bringing it. And what a man he is! You find him in a crowded forum, draped in a toga arranged just so, working the crowd with a smile that never quite reaches his calculating eyes. This is Gaius Julius Caesar, and at this point in his life, despite all the legend that will one day cling to his name, he is something rather less impressive. He is broke, spectacularly, catastrophically, eye-wateringly broke. You watch him move through the city, and you can practically smell the debt trailing behind him like a bad cologne. Caesar had spent borrowed fortunes on bribes, on lavish public games, on buttering up every voter and senator who might prove useful. And the bill had come due in the most alarming way. The man owed sums so vast that one wealthy backer had to guarantee his loans, just so Caesar could leave the city to take up a governorship without his creditors physically blocking the doors. Picture that for a moment. The future master of the Roman world, the name that will echo for 2,000 years, sneaking out of town one step ahead of the people he owes money to. You, drowning in your own modest stack of unpaid bills, may find this strangely comforting. Here is the mainstream fact to anchor your sleepy mind tonight. Caesar secured for himself, through a great deal of political maneuvering and the backing of his powerful allies, the governorship of several Roman provinces, including a stretch of territory along the northern frontier that bordered the free, Gaulish lands. It was meant to last for years, this command, an unusually long leash, and it came with the one thing a desperate, ambitious Roman craved above all else: legions, an army of his very own. An army was a money-printing machine, a path to glory, and a shield against every enemy back home who wanted to drag you into court and ruin you. Because that, you come to realize, is the engine humming beneath everything. Caesar did not merely want Gaul, he needed it. First, plunder the gold and slaves and spoils that could erase his debts and make him richer than his rivals. Second, glory, the kind of dazzling military reputation that turned ordinary politicians into untouchable legends. And third, loyalty, an army of veterans bound to him personally, men who would follow Caesar rather than the distant Senate. You begin to understand that the freedom of those northern tribes was never really the point. They simply had the bad luck to be standing between a brilliant, ruthless man and everything he wanted. Now for your quirky tidbit, and this one is genuinely delightful. Caesar was famously, almost comically vain about one particular subject, or rather the slow and tragic departure of it. The man was going bald, and it bothered him enormously. He took to carefully combing his thinning locks forward across the crown of his head, an ancient comb-over for the ages, and later treasured the laurel wreath he was awarded, partly, the gossips whispered, because it conveniently hid his receding hairline. So, as you picture this looming conqueror, this shadow falling across Gaul, do remember he was also a man fussing anxiously at a mirror, trying to make the most of what little he had left up top. Conquering nations, it seems, is easier than conquering male-pattern baldness. You drift now into the murkier question of why exactly the invasion happened when it did, and here the ground gets pleasantly uncertain. The official excuse, the one Caesar himself would later write down, with the confidence of a man grading his own homework, was that he was simply protecting Rome's allies and frontiers from dangerous migrating tribes and threatening neighbors. A defensive war, he insisted, purely responsive. He just happened to keep responding deeper and deeper into territory that was none of Rome's business. Historians still argue whether Caesar marched north as a genuine guardian reacting to real threats, or whether he was a calculating aggressor who manufactured his justifications, twisting every tribal movement into a crisis that conveniently required his legions to advance. You lying there in the dark may form your own opinion, but the trail of conquered land tells a fairly suggestive story. What makes it all the more remarkable is that Caesar was a propaganda genius centuries ahead of his time. He did not merely fight his war, he wrote it. Throughout the long campaign, he composed clear, punchy dispatches sent back to Rome, accounts of his own deeds that read like a thrilling adventure serial, always casting himself as the wise and reasonable hero responding nobly to barbarian provocation. These writings, his famous commentaries on the Gallic War, are why we know so much about what happened, and they are also, you must never forget, written entirely by the man who wanted to look good. It is rather like getting the story of a breakup exclusively from the person who did the dumping. Useful, yes. Trustworthy, well. And so the pieces are set. To the south sits a brilliant, charming, deeply indebted man with 8,000 reasons, give or take, to start a war, an army at his back, a flair for self-promotion, and a frontier just begging to be crossed. To the north lie those free, quarrelsome, barrel-rolling tribes you walked among, blissfully unaware that the most consequential bankruptcy in history is about to come marching over their fields. You feel the tension of it the way you feel a storm before it breaks that heavy stillness in the air. Caesar's hungry eyes have turned north, and somewhere in that green land a child is growing toward the day he will become Rome's most dangerous foe. But the legions move first, and they move soon. You pull yourself away from Caesar's mirror and his mountain of debt, and you let the journey lift you back north, back over those mountains into the highlands of central Gaul, where the rivers run cold and clear and the volcanoes have long gone quiet beneath their blankets of forest. This is the country of the Arverni, one of the proudest and most powerful tribes in all of Gaul, and it is here, among these green hills, that you find the child who will one day make Rome's greatest general sweat through his toga. You do not yet know his name, but you will. Everyone will. He is Vercingetorix, and right now he is just a boy running through the long grass with the easy confidence of someone born near the top of the world he knows. And he truly was born near the top. Here is your anchoring fact for the night, the solid one. Vercingetorix came from the highest rank of Arvernian nobility, the son of a man named Celtic, who had been a chieftain of real consequence, powerful enough that some sources say he had aimed to make himself king over not just the Arverni, but a wider stretch of Gaul. This was no peasant boy stumbling into greatness. This was an aristocrat raised among warriors and horses and feasting halls, taught from his earliest years that leadership was both his birthright and his burden. You watch him learn to ride before he can properly reason to handle a blade, to listen to the disputes of elders, to understand the delicate, endless web of tribal alliances and grudges that held Gaul together with little more than spit and stubbornness. But ambition, you learn, was a dangerous inheritance in this world. The Gaulish tribes, for all their love of glory, harboured a deep and prickly distrust of anyone who tried to gather too much power into a single pair of hands. The idea of a king, a true monarch ruling over many tribes, set their teeth on edge. And so, when Celtic pushed for that crown, his own people turned on him. By some accounts, he was put to death by the very nobles he hoped to rule executed for the unforgivable crime of wanting to be more than they would allow. You can imagine the shadow this cast over a young boy growing up, knowing that his father had reached for the heights and been struck down for it not by Romans, but by his own kind. It is the sort of childhood that either breaks a person or forges them into something very hard indeed. Now, for your quirky tidbit, and it lives fittingly in the boy's very name. Vercingetorix is not a name in the way you think of names, something a fond parent coos over a cradle. It reads far more like a title, a war cry stitched into syllables. Scholars who study the old Celtic tongues suggest the name breaks down into pieces, meaning something close to great king of warriors, or supreme leader of fighters, the over-chief of 100 battles. Imagine being a small child carrying a name that essentially means mighty war king before you have lost your baby teeth. It is a bit like naming your toddler supreme commander and then acting surprised when he takes charge of the sandbox. Whether his parents gave him this name at birth as a statement of dizzying ambition, or whether he earned it later and it simply stuck to him through history, is one of those tantalizing little mysteries. And here the ground gets soft and uncertain the way you like it at this hour. The truth is, you know almost nothing about his actual childhood, and neither does anyone else. Historians still argue whether the few scraps we have, the noble father, the lofty name, a possible early acquaintance with Caesar himself, are reliable history or later embroidery stitched onto a legend after the fact. Some of these details come to us third-hand, filtered through Roman pens that had every reason to shape the story. There is even a tantalizing suggestion debated to this day that a young Vercingetorix may have once served alongside the Romans, perhaps as an auxiliary cavalry commander, learning the very military methods he would later turn against. Picture that irony. The student sitting quietly in Caesar's camp, absorbing every lesson before walking away to become the teacher's worst nightmare. We cannot prove it, but oh, it is a delicious thought to drift off on. What you can feel even through the fog of lost centuries is the shape of the man taking form in the boy. He grows up watching Gaul being nibbled apart, watching tribes bow to Rome one by one, watching the proud independence of his ancestors traded away for safety or coin or sheer exhaustion. He carries the memory of a father destroyed for daring too much, and he possesses, by every account that survives, a rare and magnetic combination of qualities: the noble blood that made men listen, the fierce courage that made them follow, and a sharp strategic mind that set him apart from the glory-drunk warriors all around him. He is charismatic. He is disciplined in a land that prized wild bravery over patient planning. He is, in short, exactly the sort of leader Gaul had never quite managed to produce when it needed one most. You linger a while in those quiet highlands, watching the boy grow toward the man, knowing what is coming the way. You know the ending of a story you have read before but cannot stop turning the pages of. He does not know yet that his name will outlast the empire that is about to crush him. He does not know that 2,000 years from now, people in a country not yet imagined will raise statues to his memory. For now he is just a noble-born youth among the Arverni, full of unspent fire, waiting for a moment that has not yet come. But it is coming, and to understand why he will so nearly succeed, you must first see the terrifying machine he will dare to stand against. You leave young Vercingetorix to his highland summers, his unspent fire still banked low, and you let the journey carry you down into a Roman military camp at dusk, because before you can cheer for the underdog, you really ought to see the thing he is about to throw himself against. And oh, you feel it the moment you arrive. The Gaulish hill fort had warmth, chaos, barred by the fire, cattle lowing somewhere in the dark. This place has none of that. This place hums with a cold, ordered menace that raises the hair on your arms all over again, and not from any sacred grove this time. This is Caesar's army, the most efficient instrument of organized violence the ancient world had yet produced, and you are about to take the tour. The first thing that astonishes you is the camp itself, because they built it today, this afternoon, in a matter of hours, and they will tear it down tomorrow and build another. Here is your solid fact to lean on tonight. A Roman legion on campaign did not simply flop down wherever night caught it. Every single evening, no matter how exhausted, the soldiers dug a ditch, raised an earthen rampart, planted, sharpened wooden stakes, and laid out the interior in the exact same grid, the same streets, the same placement of tents, every time, so that any soldier could find his way blindfolded in a camp he had never seen before. You walk those straight gravel lanes, and the sheer relentless sameness of it unnerves you more than any war paint. These men turned discipline into a fortress they carried on their backs and rebuilt nightly. Your own track record with flat-pack furniture suddenly feels like a personal failing. You move among the soldiers and you study the legionary up close. He is not some hulking giant. He is an ordinary man, often shorter than you would guess, but he is wrapped in segmented iron, carrying a large curved shield, a short stabbing sword designed for tight, brutal close work, and a pair of cleverly weighted throwing javelins. And here is the genius detail you love. Those javelins, the famous peeler, were built with a soft iron neck on purpose, so that when one struck an enemy shield it would bend and hang there. Impossible to throw back, and so heavy and awkward, it forced the enemy to drop his shield entirely. The Romans weaponized inconvenience. They invented essentially the world's most aggressive way of saying, you drop this, you cannot have it back, and now you are exposed. But the part that would truly haunt the Gauls was not the weapons, it was the engineering. These soldiers were as much construction crew as killers. They built roads, bridges, siege towers, ramps, and walls with a speed that bordered on the supernatural. You will see later, when we reach a certain hill, just how monstrous their building genius could become, but for now, simply understand this. When a Roman army wanted to cross a river, it did not wait or wade or pray. It built a bridge. Caesar once famously had his men throw a timber bridge across the wide and angry Rhine. In a matter of days marched his legions over, to frighten the tribes on the far side, then marched back and tore the bridge down, essentially to prove he'd could. It was less a military necessity and more the ancient equivalent of revving your engine in someone's driveway. Now your quirky tidbit, and it is gloriously human. For all this iron discipline, the Roman soldier ran on what was basically grain and grumbling. The staple of the legionary diet was not roasted boar or feasting glory, but a relentless ration of wheat ground and baked into hard bread or boiled into a plain porridge. They ate so much grain, in fact, that soldiers reportedly complained bitterly on the rare occasions they were forced to eat meat instead, seeing it as a sign that the proper supply lines had broken down. Picture that. An army that conquered the Western world and its troops are sighing because, not steak again, where is my nice, comforting bowl of wheat mush? The mighty legions marched on porridge and complaints, which honestly makes them the most relatable conquerors in history. You also notice the chilling tool of motivation that held this machine together, and it gives you a little shiver. Roman discipline was enforced with a famous and terrible punishment for units that failed catastrophically or fled in cowardice. The unit could be decimated, meaning quite literally that 1 man in every 10 was chosen by lot and killed by his own comrades. The word you toss around casually today to decimate was born from this grim arithmetic. To stand in a Roman line was to fear the enemy in front of you, yes, but also just a little to fear the consequences of breaking ranks behind you. Fear pointed in every direction, and that in its cold way was the point. Here is where the ground softens for your sleepy mind. Historians still argue whether Caesar's legions were truly as overwhelmingly superior to the Gauls as his own writings insist, or whether he carefully exaggerated their hardships and the enemy's numbers to make every victory sound more heroic and every near defeat more excusable. Remember, the man was writing his own highlight reel. Some scholars point out that the Gauls were skilled, well-armed, and at times fielded forces that nearly matched the Romans in everything but coordination. The legions were formidable, no question, but they were not invincible, and a clever enemy who understood their weaknesses, their long supply lines, their dependence on that precious grain, their occasional overconfidence, might just find the cracks. And somewhere in the back of your drowsy mind, you remember a noble boy in the Highlands who may have spent time inside a camp exactly like this one, walking these straight gravel lanes, noting the bending javelins and the knightly walls and the porridge-fed discipline, learning, filing it all away, because the most dangerous enemy of a perfect machine is always the one who has studied how it works from the inside. The machine is magnificent, the machine is terrifying, but the machine you are beginning to suspect can be beaten. First, though, it must do its grim work and Gaul must bleed. You step out of that cold-ordered camp with its bending javelins and its porridge-fed soldiers, and the journey carries you forward through time, not gently this time, but in lurching, weary jumps, season after season, because what unfolds now is not a single battle, but a long, grinding tragedy that stretches across years. You feel it in your bones before you see it. The way the green land you wandered on that first night slowly changes the wood smoke, turning to the smoke of burning villages, the bard song falling silent in hall after hall. This is the slow bleeding of Gaul, and there is no clean moment of conquest, no single dramatic fall. There is only the patient, methodical dismantling of a whole world tribe by tribe, year by year. It begins as these things so often do, with division. Here is your anchoring fact, and it is the most important one for understanding everything that follows. Caesar did not conquer Gaul by sheer force alone. He conquered it by exploiting the endless rivalries between the tribes, allying with some to crush others, then turning on his former friends once they were no longer useful. Remember that patchwork quilt of squabbling peoples you walked through on the first night, each one happy to raid its neighbor's cattle. That very disunity became the blade Caesar slid between their ribs. When one tribe felt threatened by a stronger rival, it would invite the Romans in as protectors, never quite grasping that a protector with legions does not tend to leave. You watch it happen again and again, this fatal pattern, and you want to shout a warning across the centuries, but of course no one can hear you, and besides you are very comfortable and quite sleepy. You witness the early campaigns roll out one after another. A great migrating people, the Helvetii, pushed back and shattered. Fierce Germanic war bands driven across the Rhine, coastal tribes who lived by their ships and trade, brought low when Caesar simply built a fleet and beat them at their own seafaring game. The Belgae in the north, among the most warlike of all the Gauls, ground down in brutal fighting. With each campaign the same grim machinery turned the knightly camps, the bending javelins, the siege ramps, the cold patience. And after each victory the spoils flowed south, the gold and the captives, easing Caesar's famous debts and swelling his glory exactly as he had planned. The conquest was a business, and business, you note with a shiver, was booming. Now your quirky tidbit, and this one is genuinely staggering to sit with in the dark. The scale of human suffering in this conquest was almost beyond comprehension, and one ancient writer claimed that over the course of the entire war, Caesar's campaigns resulted in roughly 1 million Gauls killed and another million sold into slavery, out of a population that may have numbered only a handful of millions to begin with. Now, here is the quirk. Caesar himself reported these enormous numbers, and he did not report them with shame. He reported them as achievements, as proud entries on his resume, the ancient equivalent of listing your quarterly targets crushed. Imagine being so comfortable with the arithmetic of catastrophe that you brag about it in your own memoir. The numbers are likely inflated, as ancient figures usually are, but even halved or quartered, they describe a wound to a civilization from which it would never fully recover. You drift through a captured oppidum in the aftermath, and the silence is the loudest thing you have ever heard. The clever timber and stone walls you once admired stand breached and blackened. The communal ovens are cold. The minted coins lie scattered in the mud, and you understand now, in a way the history books rarely make you feel, that conquest is not a line on a map being redrawn. It is 10,000 small endings, a workshop with no smith, a feasting hall with no feast, a people who season by season are being erased, not just from their land, but from the future itself. Their children carried south in chains to serve in households that will never learn their names. And yet you notice something stirring beneath the despair, something Caesar may have underestimated. The very brutality of the conquest was beginning to do what centuries of shared language and shared gods had never quite managed. It was teaching the tribes that their old rivalries were a luxury they could no longer afford. A chief, who watched a neighboring tribe enslaved, began to suspect, with cold dread, that his own people were simply next in the queue. The lesson was written in smoke and chains across the whole of Gaul, and slowly, painfully, some among them began to learn it. The patchwork was just beginning to consider whether it might stitch itself into something stronger. Here the ground softens as it must at this hour. Historians still argue whether Caesar's conquest of Gaul should be understood as a brilliant if ruthless military achievement, or whether it crosses fully into the territory of what we would today call a deliberate war of extermination and a genocide. The debate is fierce, and it is not merely academic, because how we name the thing shapes how we remember the man. Was this the unfortunate cost of empire, or was it mass slaughter dressed up in the elegant Latin of a self-serving memoir? You lying there warm and safe and very far removed are spared the need to decide tonight. But the question hangs in the air all the same. So Gaul bleeds, and the tribes fall one after another, like the slow toppling of a row of stones. Caesar grows richer, more famous, more powerful, his legions hardened into veterans who would follow him anywhere, even one day against Rome itself. It seems in these dark years that the conquest is all but finished, that free Gaul is a thing of the past, a memory fading like the bard songs in the burned halls. But empires that grow comfortable make mistakes, and conquerors who believe a land is broken sometimes turn their backs at exactly the wrong moment. And far away in the south across the mountains, Caesar is about to do precisely that. You linger in the silence of those broken oppida, the smoke still drifting in your memory, and then the journey shifts the season hard beneath your feet, plunging you into the deep cold of midwinter. The land that bled through all those campaigns now lies frozen, and still snow heavy on the bare branches, the rivers crusted with ice at their edges, breath hanging in the air like little ghosts. And into this frozen stillness comes a change you can feel before you can name it, a tension in the cold, a held breath across the whole of Gaul. Because Caesar, the cold, patient machine who broke a civilization, has just made the one move he should not have made. He has left. Here is your anchoring fact, and everything that follows hangs upon it. Roman armies traditionally did not campaign in the dead of winter. They scattered their legions into winter quarters spread across the conquered territory, and the generals often withdrew to attend to politics elsewhere. And so in this particular bitter season, Caesar had crossed back over the mountains, down into Roman Italy, to manage the tangled and increasingly dangerous web of politics back home, where his rivals were circling and his alliances were fraying. His legions remained in Gaul, yes, but they were dispersed, settled into scattered camps for the cold months, and the man himself, the brain of the whole operation, was a long, snowbound journey away on the wrong side of the mountains. To the watching Gauls, it must have looked like the wolf had finally turned its back. You drift now from hall to hall in the frozen dark, and you sense the whispers. They pass between tribes the way warmth passes between hands cupped around a fire, quiet, urgent, alive. The chieftains who survived the bleeding years are talking, and they are doing the arithmetic that despair and brutality had finally taught them. The Romans are scattered. The legions cannot easily reinforce one another across a frozen, roadless country. The supply lines that feed all that porridge-loving discipline are stretched thin and vulnerable in the cold. And Caesar, the irreplaceable Caesar, is on the far side of the Alps, trapped by the very same winter that traps his soldiers. If ever there was a moment to rise, a moment when the perfect machine might be caught with its gears half frozen, this is it. You can almost hear the realization spreading like a crack racing across river ice. Now your quirky tidbit, and it is a strange and rather beautiful one. The Gauls had no telegraph, no riders fast enough to coordinate a whole country in secret, and yet word of rebellion needed to travel swiftly and quietly across vast distances without the Romans catching wind of it. According to the accounts, the tribes passed urgent news through a remarkable relay, shouting it across the open countryside, from settlement to settlement, voices carrying the message from one village to the next, a human chain of sound rippling across the land far faster than any messenger on a winter road could ride. By this method, it was said, news could cross enormous stretches of Gaul in a single day. Picture it. An entire conspiracy carried on the shouted breath of farmers and shepherds. A rebellion spread by the ancient equivalent of a group chat, except the notifications were actual people yelling across frozen fields. There is something wonderfully human in the thought that the Great Uprising began in part as a very loud game of telephone. You feel the spark catch first in a single act of defiance, sudden and shocking. One tribe, their patience finally snapped by Roman demands, and the humiliations of occupation rose up and struck, killing Roman traders and officials who had settled among them in the false peace. It was the kind of act from which there is no return, a door slammed and barred against any going back. Blood had been spilled, Roman blood, and every tribe watching knew that Caesar's vengeance, when it came, would not distinguish too carefully between rebel and bystander. The choice was suddenly stark and simple. Rise together now, while the wolf is away, or be devoured one by one as you had been for years. Fear, that great enemy of unity, had finally flipped over and become its engine. And here, into this gathering storm, steps the figure you have been waiting for. The whispers and the shouted relays and the first acts of bloody defiance all needed a centre, a will, a name to gather around, because the Gauls had learned the hard way that scattered courage simply got you conquered in detail. Somewhere in the highlands of the Arverni, that noble-born youth you watched running through the long grass has become a man, and the moment has arrived to which his whole strange life seems to have pointed. Vercingetorix begins to move, to speak, to summon, to weave the loose threads of rage and fear and desperate hope into something that might actually hold. The boy with the war king's name is about to earn it. Here the ground softens for your drowsy mind. Historians still argue whether this great winter uprising was a long-planned, carefully coordinated conspiracy that had been quietly assembling for months, simply waiting for Caesar to turn his back, or whether it was a more spontaneous, opportunistic explosion that caught fire faster than anyone, including its own leaders, had intended. The accounts we have, filtered as ever through Roman pens, naturally favour the idea of a sinister organised plot, because a deliberate conspiracy makes the eventual Roman victory look all the more impressive. The truth likely sits somewhere in the cold between a slow accumulation of grievance that needed only the right season and the right spark to blaze. Whatever its true shape, the spark is lit now, glowing in the winter dark, and there is no putting it out. Caesar is far away, his legions scattered and shivering, his back turned at precisely the wrong moment. The shouted news races across the frozen land. The tribes, for the first time in their long and quarrelsome history, are beginning to act as one, and at the heart of it, gathering them to him with a force of will that will astonish even his enemies, stands the last free chief of the Arverni, ready at last to step into the firelight of history. You hold on to that image of the spark glowing in the winter dark, the shouted news racing across the frozen fields, and now the journey draws you in, close to the man at the centre of it all, because the hardest thing he must do is not fight Romans. Not yet. The hardest thing he must do is unite the Gauls, and if you remember anything from that very first night by the fire, you will know what an absurd, near impossible task that truly was. These were people who had spent centuries perfecting the art of despising their neighbours. Asking them to fight as one was a little like asking 60 cats to pull a single sled in the same direction, and yet standing before them the young chief of the Arverni is about to try. You watch him work and you understand quickly that this is no ordinary warlord. Here is your anchoring fact. Vercingetorix did not inherit his command of the Great Rebellion. He seized it, and not without struggle, even among his own people. When he first called the Arverni to rise against Rome, the cautious elders of his own tribe, the very nobles who feared overreaching ambition, threw him out of the chief town, expelling him as a dangerous troublemaker, exactly the sort of figure who had gotten his father killed. But he did not slink away. He gathered the poor, the desperate, the landless fighting men from the countryside, built his own following from the ground up, returned, drove out the cautious elders in turn, and had himself proclaimed leader. He took power the hard way, by sheer force of will and personal magnetism, and only then did he turn outward to the other tribes. And here his real genius reveals itself, because uniting his own tribe was merely the warm-up act. He sent envoys racing across Gaul, calling tribe after tribe to his banner, and one by one, astonishingly, they came. Peoples who had raided each other for generations, who spoke in different dialects and worshipped at different groves, set aside their ancient grudges and acknowledged this young Arvernian as their war leader. You watch the alliance grow in the firelit halls, chief after chief clasping arms, and you can scarcely believe it. The patchwork quilt you walked through on that first night is for one shining and improbable moment stitching itself into a single banner. It had never happened before, not truly, not like this. Whatever else history would say about him, Vercingetorix did the thing every Gaulish leader before him had failed to do. Now your quirky tidbit, and it tells you everything about how he held this fragile thing together. Vercingetorix understood in a way his glory-hungry predecessors never had, that an alliance built on enthusiasm alone would melt like spring snow the moment things got hard. So he ruled his confederation with an iron, almost frightening discipline, and the accounts describe his methods in vivid, wince-inducing detail. For serious crimes and betrayals he handed out death, but for lesser offences, for cowardice or shirking, or minor disobedience, his punishments were calibrated to humiliate and deter. He would, by some accounts, cut off an ear or put out an eye and send the offender home as a living warning to others. Picture that for a discipline policy. Not a stern memo, not a written warning, but a one-eyed man limping back to his village as a walking, blinking reminder that the chief means business. Brutal, undeniably. Effective. Well, the tribes did for once actually fall into line. You begin to grasp the sheer scale of what he had assembled, and it stirs a flicker of hope even in your sleepy chest. This was not a ragged warband. This was a genuine national army drawn from across the whole of central and western Gaul, with cavalry, infantry, and the collective weight of a people who had finally decided they would rather die free than be enslaved one tribe at a time. For the first time since Caesar marched north, the Romans faced not a single tribe to be picked off, not a convenient rivalry to exploit, but a unified Gaul led by a man who understood discipline, who may well have studied the Roman war machine from the inside, and who had a clear and ruthless strategy already forming in his mind. The cracks Caesar had always exploited were, for this brief and brilliant season, being sealed shut. And yet you must not let the hope blind you, because the alliance, for all its glory, was fragile to its core. It was held together by Vercingetorix's personal authority, by fear and charisma, and the shared terror of Rome, and not by any deep or lasting institution. Old jealousies still simmered beneath the surface. Powerful tribes resented taking orders from an Arvernian. Some chiefs followed reluctantly, watching for any sign of weakness, any failure that might justify slipping away. The whole magnificent confederation was in truth only ever one or two defeats away from flying apart at the seams. You sense this, even as you marvel at it, the way you sense the thinness of ice, even as you admire how far it stretches. Here the ground softens for the night. Historians still argue whether Vercingetorix truly forged a unified Gaulish nation in any meaningful sense, a genuine flowering of national feeling, or whether his confederation was always a temporary and brittle wartime coalition that would have shattered back into squabbling tribes the moment the Roman threat receded. Some see in him the first great champion of a Gaulish identity, a man centuries ahead of his time. Others, more cautious, see a brilliant opportunist who united people through fear and necessity rather than any shared dream of nationhood. The romance and the skepticism wrestle endlessly over his memory. But whatever the truth of his deeper aims, the fact before you tonight is plain and remarkable. A young man thrown out by his own elders gathered the unrulest people in the ancient world and bound them into a single fighting force, aimed squarely at the most dangerous general alive. The untable had been united, The spark had become a fire, and now this fragile, glorious alliance had to decide how exactly it meant to fight a war machine that had never yet been beaten. The strategy Vercingetorix chose would be as ruthless as his discipline, and it would ask of his people the hardest sacrifice of all. You sit with that fragile, glorious alliance, the untable united at last, and now you lean in to hear the strategy, because Vercingetorix has done the arithmetic that his glory-loving ancestors never could. And the answer he has reached is going to ask the most painful thing imaginable of the very people who follow him. He gathers the chiefs in the fire-lit dark, and what he tells them is not a rousing call to meet the Romans in open battle, sword to sword, glory to glory. It is something far colder, far harder, and far more clever. He tells them they must burn their own world to the ground. Here is your anchoring fact, the strategic heart of the whole rebellion. Vercingetorix understood the single greatest weakness of Caesar's terrifying machine. Remember all that knightly discipline, those bending javelins, those porridge-loving soldiers. An army that runs on grain is an army that must be fed constantly, enormously. And the Roman legions in the heart of Gaul, far from their own supply lines, depended utterly on living off the land around them, seizing grain from Gaulish fields and storehouses to keep marching. So Vercingetorix proposed to take that food away. His strategy was scorched earth, deny the enemy everything, burn the crops in the fields, empty and torch the storehouses, destroy the farms and villages that lay in the Roman path, so that wherever the legions marched they would find only ash-empty land and the gnawing emptiness of their own bellies. Let the land itself become the weapon. Let hunger fight the war that swords could not yet win. You watch the chiefs absorb this, and you see the horror dawn on their faces because they understand exactly what he is asking. He is not asking them to burn the enemy's homes. He is asking them to burn their own, their harvests, the grain that would feed their children through the winter, their villages, the halls where their bards sang and their ancestors were remembered, their farms, the land their families had worked for generations. He is asking a people to commit slow suicide on the gamble that the Romans will starve first. It is a strategy of breathtaking ruthlessness, and the fact that he persuaded them to attempt it at all tells you everything about the force of his will and the depth of their desperation. And mostly they do it. You drift across the land and you watch the fires bloom on the horizon, not Roman fires this time, but Gaulish ones, deliberate and terrible as the tribes put their own world to the torch. The accounts speak of enormous numbers of villages and farmsteads burned in a single day, the smoke rising in a great pall across the country as a people deliberately destroyed everything they owned rather than let it feed the wolf. It is one of the most heartbreaking images in the whole story, this land setting itself alight, and you feel the weight of it settle over you, the terrible courage it took, the love of freedom that could drive people to such a sacrifice. Now your quirky tidbit, and it is the human exception that proves how hard the whole plan really was. The scorched earth strategy worked only as far as people could bear to carry it out, and there was one town the Gauls simply could not bring themselves to burn. We will come to it soon and to the heartbreak it caused, but the detail to hold tonight is this. When Vercingetorix ordered the destruction of a particularly beautiful and beloved town, its own people fell to their knees and begged him to spare it, pleading that it was among the fairest in all of Gaul, too lovely to destroy. And against his own better judgment, against the cold logic of his own brilliant strategy, he relented. Imagine the strategist's agony, knowing the plan demands the torch and choosing mercy anyway because his people wept. It is the single most human crack in an otherwise ironclad mind, and as you will see, it would cost him dearly. Even the most ruthless war king, it turns out, could be talked out of burning something pretty. You begin to appreciate just how sophisticated this whole gamble was, because the scorched earth was only half of it. Alongside the burning, Vercingetorix avoided pitched battle wherever he could, refusing to throw his fragile alliance against the legions in the kind of open, set-piece slaughter that Caesar excelled at. Instead, he relied on his strong cavalry to harass the Romans constantly. cutting off foraging parties, striking at supply columns, picking at the edges of the army like wolves, worrying a wounded bull, never quite committing to the full charge. It was a war of patience and attrition, of hunger and harassment, designed to bleed the Romans slowly, to wear down their strength and their morale, until the unbeatable machine, far from home and starving, simply fell apart. It was, in short, exactly the kind of war the proud, glory-hungry Gauls were temperamentally least suited to fight. And the fact that Vercingetorix made them fight it anyway is a measure of his extraordinary command. Here the ground softens for your drowsy mind. Historians still argue whether this scorched-earth strategy was a stroke of military genius that came tantalizingly close to defeating Caesar outright, or whether it was a desperate gamble that inflicted such grievous suffering on the Gauls themselves that it weakened the rebellion as much as it weakened Rome. After all, a people who have burned their own grain are a people who will also eventually grow hungry, and an alliance held together by fragile loyalty does not easily endure the sight of its own villages in flames. The strategy was a knife with no handle, cutting whoever wielded it. Brilliant or ruinous, or perhaps both at once, it remains one of the most debated decisions of the entire war. But for now the fires are burning, the smoke is rising across the land, and the gamble is underway. Caesar, hurrying back over the mountains to a Gaul suddenly aflame and united against him, finds a country transformed, his enemy, no longer scattered tribes, but a single starving strategy machine of its own. The wolf is hungry, the land is ash, and the first great test of Vercingetorix's terrible plan is about to arrive at the gates of that one beautiful town his people could not bear to burn. You follow the smoke now to the one place that would not burn, that beautiful, beloved town his people fell to their knees to save, and you feel the dread gathering as you approach, because you already know the way, you know the shape of tragedy before its final act, that mercy here is going to turn to horror. The town is called Avaricum, and it sits among marshes and rivers, ringed by strong walls, proud and fair, the kind of place a people point to and say that that is worth living for. And that precisely is the problem. His heart and the tears of its citizens demanded its survival. He chose survival, and now you must stand inside it and watch what that choice costs. Here is your anchoring fact, and it is grim. Caesar, hungry and harassed and badly needing a victory to feed his army and restore his momentum, marched his legions to Avaricum and laid siege to it. And the Romans, you will remember, were not merely soldiers but the most terrifying engineers the ancient world had produced. They set about building, with their supernatural speed and discipline, an enormous siege ramp, a vast sloping mound of timber and earth, driven steadily toward the town walls, tall enough to bring their siege towers and soldiers level with the defenders. The defenders of Avaricum, Gauls of real courage and ingenuity, fought back with everything they had, undermining the ramp, setting it ablaze, raising their own walls higher, hurling down fire and stone. For a time, it was a genuine contest, defender against engineer, desperation against discipline. You stand among those defenders, and you marvel at their cleverness, because the Gauls of Avaricum were no helpless victims. They countered Roman siegecraft with siegecraft of their own, tunneling beneath the great ramp, to collapse it using clever grappling devices to snare the Roman battering rams, deflecting the assault with a resourcefulness that impressed even Caesar. Remember those skilled metalworkers and builders you admired on the very first night the people history tried to dismiss as savages. Here they are, matching Roman engineering blow for blow, holding off the greatest army in the world from behind their beloved walls. For a while hope flickers. For a while you almost believe the lovely town might hold. But here is the cruel arithmetic of a siege. Vercingetorix with his main army camped nearby and harassed the Romans, constantly trying to cut off their supplies, trying to starve the besiegers even as they pressed the town, his whole strategy still turning on hunger. Yet he could not bring himself to commit his fragile alliance to a full-pitched battle to break the siege, and so he hovered, helping but unable to save, watching the trap close. And inside Avaricum the Romans finally finished their monstrous ramp. They chose a day of cold, driving rain when the defenders least expected an assault, and they stormed the walls. The town fell, and then comes the heartbreak that gives this section its name, and you must brace yourself because it is dreadful. The Roman soldiers, you will recall, had been hungry for weeks, harassed and starved by the very scorched earth strategy that had spared this town. Their porridge rations thin, their tempers raw, their losses bitter. When Avaricum fell, that fury and that hunger were unleashed without mercy. Here is your Tibet, and it is a sorrowful one rather than a charming one tonight. The accounts state that of the great many thousands of people sheltering within the town, men, women, the old and the young alike, only a few hundred escaped to reach Vercingetorix's camp. The rest did not survive the sack. The lovely town that its people had begged to spare became in a single terrible day one of the worst massacres of the entire war. The mercy had become a grave. You sit with the weight of that because it is the cruelest lesson the rebellion would learn. Vercingetorix had been right all along. The cold strategist who wanted to burn Avaricum had understood something his weeping people could not bear to accept, that in this kind of war, a beautiful town held was a beautiful town that became a trap, a place where thousands could be gathered and then destroyed all at once. Mercy, in the brutal logic of survival, had been the deadliest choice of all, and the agonizing thing is that Vercingetorix knew it had said it and had been overruled by love and tears. He had been a better strategist than he was allowed to be. But here in the ashes of the disaster you witness the true measure of the man, the thing that separates a leader from a mere commander. When the survivors stumbled into his camp, broken and grieving, the rebellion teetered on the edge of collapse, the alliance murmuring that perhaps this Arvernian had led them to ruin. And Vercingetorix did not flinch or hide. He gathered his people and reminded them with bracing honesty that he had warned against defending Avaricum, that the disaster was the result of ignoring his strategy, not following it. And then, astonishingly, his standing among the tribes grew stronger rather than weaker. The catastrophe proved him right, and a leader proven right by tragedy commands a deeper loyalty than one who merely wins. The alliance held. The fire still burned. Here the ground softens for the night. Historians still argue whether Vercingetorix made a grave strategic error in allowing Avaricum to be defended at all, bowing to sentiment against his own better judgment, or whether the town's defence doomed, as it was served a real purpose, by tying down and bleeding Caesar's army for crucial weeks, while the wider rebellion gathered strength. Some see only a tragic blunder, others see a costly but deliberate delaying action. The line between sacrifice and mistake is as ever drawn differently by different hands. Whatever its meaning, Avaricum was behind him now a smoking ruin and a terrible lesson learned. The scorched earth war would go on, but Vercingetorix had been hardened by the heartbreak. His resolve sharpened, his authority deepened, and ahead lay a place where for once the cold strategist would get everything right, where the unbeatable Caesar would finally taste the bitter flavour of defeat, and where the last free Gaul would rise to the very summit of his improbable career. The hills of Gergovia were waiting. You leave the smoking grave of Avaricum behind, that terrible lesson written in ash, and the journey carries you up now, climbing the air, thinning and sharpening as you ascend into high country, because Vercingetorix has chosen at last to make his stand on ground of his own choosing, and the place he has chosen sits on a hill. This is Gergovia, the chief stronghold of his own people, the Arverni, a town perched atop a steep plateau with commanding views in every direction, ringed by slopes that turn any attacker's advance into a slow, exhausting, exposed crawl. After all the burning, all the harassment, all the heartbreak, the War King has finally picked the battlefield, and he has picked it with the eye of a man who learned, perhaps, exactly how Romans liked to fight, and then chose ground where none of it would work. Here is your anchoring fact, the one that matters most tonight. At Gergovia, Vercingetorix inflicted a real and stinging defeat on Julius Caesar. The only major undisputed battlefield defeat Caesar suffered during the entire Gallic War. Let that settle over you in the dark, because it is extraordinary. The man whose legions had broken a civilization, who had crossed the Rhine to show off, and conquered tribe after tribe, was beaten, genuinely beaten by the chief of the Arverni on these very slopes. Caesar, ever the careful author of his own legend, would later write about Gergovia at length, taking great pains to explain precisely why it was not really his fault, which is, you might note, generally the surest sign that a thing was in fact rather a lot his fault. You watch the battle unfold and you understand the trap of the place. Caesar brought his legions up and camped near the hill, probing for a way to take the stronghold, but the terrain favoured the defenders at every turn. The slopes were steep, the approaches narrow, the Gauls dug in above with the high ground and the home field advantage. Vercingetorix, holding his disciplined alliance together on the heights, simply let the geography do much of his work, refusing to come down and fight on Caesar's terms, forcing the Romans to consider the grim prospect of charging uphill into a prepared and waiting enemy. The cold, patient machine for once found itself facing a foe who had learned patience of his own. Now your quirky tidbit, and it speaks to how the defeat actually came about, because it was not pure strategy that undid Caesar, but something far more human. When the Roman assault finally came surging up the difficult slopes, it began as a limited, controlled probe, exactly the cautious sort of move Caesar preferred. But the legionaries, those iron-disciplined men who feared decimation more than death, were swept up in their own momentum and their hunger for glory, and they pressed the attack far beyond what Caesar had ordered, charging higher and higher up the hill in defiance of the signals to halt. Picture that delicious irony. The most disciplined army in the world lost the Battle of Gergovia in part because its soldiers got too excited and stopped following orders. The machine for one fatal afternoon ran away with itself, and the Gauls, fighting downhill on their own ground, fell upon the overextended legionaries and hurled them back in bloody disorder. The slaughter on those slopes was severe. The accounts speak of many hundreds of Roman dead, including a striking number of centurions, the veteran officers who were the very backbone of the legions, the irreplaceable hard core of Caesar's discipline. To lose ordinary soldiers was painful. To lose centurions in such numbers was a genuine wound to the army's strength and confidence. The Romans were thrown back down the hill they had so recklessly climbed, and Vercingetorix held Gergovia. The unbeatable man had been beaten, and the news of it would ripple across Gaul like fire across dry grass, electrifying the rebellion, drawing wavering tribes off the fence and onto the war king's banner. Suddenly, impossibly, it looked as though free Gaul might actually win. You stand on those heights in the aftermath and you let yourself taste it, this rare and precious flavour of triumph, because you have followed this story through so much smoke and sorrow that the victory feels like cool water. For one shining moment, the arithmetic seemed to favour the Gauls. Caesar, defeated and bleeding centurions, was forced to withdraw from Gergovia entirely, abandoning the siege, pulling back to lick his wounds and rethink the entire campaign. His aura of invincibility, that psychological weapon worth a whole legion on its own, had cracked. And every chieftain in Gaul who had been waiting to see which way the wind would blow now felt it shift toward Vercingetorix. Here the ground softens for your drowsy mind. Historians still argue whether Gergovia was a true masterstroke by Vercingetorix, a battle he cleverly engineered and won through superior generalship, or whether it was as much a case of Caesar overreaching and his troops blundering ablaze. To defeat the Romans largely handed to themselves through indiscipline and bad ground. Caesar's own account, naturally, leans hard toward the second reading, blaming his soldiers' uncontrolled ardour rather than his enemy's brilliance. The truth likely braids the two together, a Gaulish leader who chose his ground wisely, and a Roman army that for once defeated itself by being too eager. Either way, the result on the slopes was the same, but you must not let the sweetness of the moment lull you into forgetting the fragility beneath it, because that is the cruel heart of this whole story. Vercingetorix had won his greatest victory. He stood at the very summit of his improbable career, the man who had united the untable, who had starved the wolf, who had now beaten Caesar himself on a hilltop in his own homeland. And yet the alliance was still held together by personal will and momentary success, the old jealousies still simmering the whole thing, only ever a defeat or two from flying apart. Triumph in this war was always perched on a knife's edge. And in the flush of victory, with the wind at his back and the tribes flocking to him, Vercingetorix was about to make the one rash gamble that even his cool, disciplined mind could not resist, the single decision that would turn the whole tide of history. You stand at the summit of his triumph, the wind at his back, the tribes flocking to his banner, and now you must watch the moment turn, because here is where the whole improbable story tips on its axis. Caesar beaten at Gergovia, his aura cracked, his army bloodied, did the only sensible thing. He withdrew. He began to march away, pulling his legions back toward friendlier territory, away from the heartland of the rebellion, looking to regroup, resupply, and link up with reinforcements. To Vercingetorix, watching the great Roman column trudge across the open country, retreating vulnerable, strung out along the roads, it must have looked like the most tempting target in the world. And temptation, as you know, is where even the wisest minds come undone. Here is your anchoring fact, the hinge of everything. Vercingetorix, flush with his victory, and eager to deliver a final crushing blow while Caesar was on the back foot, abandoned for one fatal moment the patient defensive harassing strategy that had brought him so far. Instead of merely worrying the edges of the Roman column with his superior cavalry, instead of continuing the slow war of hunger and attrition that had so nearly worked, he gambled. He decided to throw his strong cavalry into a major attack on the marching Roman army, aiming to break it apart on the move to turn a retreat into a rout. It was bold. It was aggressive. It was exactly the kind of glory-seeking, decisive stroke the Gauls had always loved. And it was, as it turned out, precisely the wrong choice at precisely the wrong moment. You ride into the attack and you feel the thunder of it, the Gaulish horsemen sweeping down upon the Roman column in three great bodies, confident, victorious, certain that the beaten enemy would crack. The Gaulish cavalry was genuinely excellent, you must understand, often superior to Rome's own horsemen, and Vercingetorix had every reason to trust it. For a moment the charge looks like it might work. The Romans pressed and harried along their line of march. But Caesar, that cold and resourceful mind, had prepared for exactly this. He had recently strengthened his forces with cavalry recruited from across the Rhine, fierce Germanic horsemen, and he now unleashed them against the attacking Gauls. The Germanic cavalry, hard and disciplined, broke the Gaulish charge, scattered the horsemen, and turned the bold gamble into a sudden, humiliating disaster. Now your quirky tidbit, and it is a thread of irony you have been quietly holding all along. Remember from many sections ago the way Caesar built a bridge across the Rhine simply to frighten the German tribes and prove that he could. The ancient equivalent of revving his engine in their driveway, those very Germanic peoples whom Caesar had once crossed the river to intimidate, were now fighting for him, riding under Roman command. And it was their horsemanship that shattered Vercingetorix's cavalry at the decisive moment. The enemy Caesar had once gone out of his way to terrify had become the instrument of his salvation. There is a strange poetry in it that the bridge built for menace circled back years later to save the man who built it. History, it seems, keeps stranger accounts than any banker. The defeat was a catastrophe far beyond the loss of a single cavalry engagement, because it shattered something more precious than horsemen. It shattered the whole logic of Vercingetorix's war. His cavalry had been the keen edge of his strategy, the tool with which he harassed Roman supplies and controlled the open country and kept the legions hungry and off balance. With that cavalry broken and scattered, he lost his ability to fight the patient, mobile war of attrition that had so nearly starved Caesar into ruin. The wolf, which had been growing thin and desperate, suddenly had room to breathe, to maneuver, to resupply. And Vercingetorix, his bold gamble in ruins, his horsemen routed, found himself with a stark and terrible choice. You watch him make it, and you feel the weight of it settle over the whole rebellion. With his cavalry gone and the open country no longer his to command, Vercingetorix gathered his remaining army, his infantry, and what horsemen he could rally, and withdrew into the nearest strong fortress to regroup, to wait to hold until the Phocans, the rest of Gaul, could rally to his aid. It seemed in the moment the prudent move, the safe move, the way a beaten boxer retreats to his corner. He fell back into a hilltop stronghold whose name you are about to learn very well, a place called Alesia. But in withdrawing there and trading the open country for the apparent safety of high walls, he made the very mistake his whole career had been built upon avoiding. He let himself be cornered. He gave the greatest siege engineer in history a single fixed target to surround. Here the ground softens for the night. Historians still argue whether the cavalry attack was a genuine blunder, a moment of overconfidence in which Vercingetorix threw away his winning strategy out of pride and impatience, or whether it was a reasonable calculated risk that simply failed because of Caesar's clever use of those Germanic horsemen, an unlucky outcome rather than a foolish one. Some see a leader who let victory go to his head and abandoned the patient plan that was working. Others see a commander making a defensible bid to finish the war quickly undone by a factor he could not have fully anticipated. The line between a bold stroke and a fatal error is as ever drawn only in hindsight, but whatever its true nature, the consequence was beyond dispute. The gamble failed, the cavalry broke, the war of patience was over, and the last free chief of Gaul was now falling back behind the walls of a hilltop fortress with the most dangerous general alive marching steadily after him. The momentum that had carried him to the summit at Gergovia was gone, reversed in a single afternoon of thundering hooves and Germanic steel. And ahead lay the place where it would all be decided, where the War King's improbable story would reach its terrible climax, where Caesar would build something so monstrous and so brilliant that men would marvel at it for 2,000 years. The hill of Alesia was waiting, and the trap was about to close. You follow the broken cavalry off the open plain, the thunder of that failed charge still ringing in your ears, and you climb now with Vercingetorix and his weary army up the slopes of the place where everything will be decided. This is Alesia, and you must look at it carefully, because the very thing that makes it feel safe is the thing that will doom it. It is a hill town. A strong oppidum perched atop a high plateau ringed by rivers in the valleys below and by neighbouring heights all around, with steep approaches that would make any direct assault a nightmare. To a beaten commander seeking shelter, it looks like a fortress sent by the gods. To a master siege engineer marching up behind him, it looks like something else entirely. It looks like a cage that simply needs a lock. Here is your anchoring fact, and it is the cruel pivot of the whole campaign. By withdrawing his entire army into Alesia, Vercingetorix concentrated the heart of the Gaulish rebellion in a single fixed place, and in doing so, he handed Caesar exactly the kind of target the Roman war machine was best in all the world at: destroying. Remember, from many nights ago, that the Romans were not merely soldiers, but the most terrifying engineers. The ancient world produced men who built knightly walls and threw bridges across the Rhine for sport. A mobile enemy could dance away from such men, but an enemy who stood still, who gathered himself behind walls on a hill, gave the engineers the one thing they craved: a fixed point to surround, to wall in, to strangle. The War King, who had spent his whole campaign refusing to be pinned down, had, in his moment of weakness, pinned himself down at last. You stand atop the plateau and look out at the great host gathered there, and the numbers stagger you. Within Alesia, Vercingetorix had concentrated an enormous army, by the accounts some 80,000 fighting men, along with the ordinary townsfolk who already lived there. It was a tremendous force, the gathered might of the rebellion, and on the face of it that great number seemed like strength. But you feel the cold arithmetic creeping in, because 80,000 men and a town full of civilians need one thing above all others, and they need it constantly. They need to eat. And Alesia, for all its lofty walls, held only so much grain. The very concentration that looked like power was, in truth, a clock, and the clock had already begun to tick down toward hunger. Now your quirky tidbit, and it captures the strange psychology of the trap. Vercingetorix was not in his own mind making a desperate last stand at all. He believed he was setting a clever counter-trap. His plan was to hold Alesia to tie Caesar down, besieging it, and meanwhile to summon a vast relief army from across all of Gaul. A second host that would march to Alesia and catch the Romans between two forces, the defenders inside and the relievers outside, crushing Caesar's legions like a nut in a pincer. Before the siege closed completely, he sent his cavalry slipping out under cover of night, riding off across Gaul with urgent orders to every tribe to raise their warriors and come to his aid. So, the man on the hill was not waiting to die. He was waiting to win. He had in effect decided to use himself as bait. It was audacious, even brilliant, and it depended entirely on two things he could not control: whether the rest of Gaul would answer the call, and whether they would arrive before the grain ran out. You watch Caesar arrive at the foot of the hill, survey the strong plateau, weigh the steep approaches, and reach the conclusion that would make Alesia immortal. He would not storm it. To charge those slopes against 80,000 defenders would be madness, a second and far bloodier Gergovia. Instead, the great engineer would do what Romans did best. He would wall the entire hill, the whole vast circumference of it, in a ring of fortifications, and simply wait for hunger to do the killing for him. He would turn the besiegers' patience into a weapon, exactly as Vercingetorix had once tried to turn the land's emptiness into one. The two strategists, the Roman and the Gaul, were now locked in a contest of starvation, each betting that the other would crack first. And so the trap closed, slow and inexorable, the Roman lines beginning to rise around the base of the hill. Vercingetorix, looking down from his walls, could only watch the encirclement take shape and trust in the cavalry he had sent galloping into the night. Trust that somewhere out across, burning, bleeding Gaul, the tribes were gathering, that the relief army would come, that the pincer would close on Caesar before starvation closed on Alesia. It was a race, now a grim and silent race between two hungers, and one great gathering host still far away over the horizon. Here the ground softens for your drowsy mind. Historians still argue whether Vercingetorix's decision to retreat into Alesia was a catastrophic blunder that threw away the rebellion by handing Caesar the perfect siege target, or whether it was a calculated and even reasonable gamble, a deliberate strategy to lure Caesar into a trap that very nearly worked. Some see a beaten man cornering himself out of caution. Others see a bold commander baiting the hook with his own army, gambling everything on the unity of a Gaul he had himself created. The accounts that survive cannot fully settle it, and so the debate burns on 2,000 years later over a hill and a choice and a clock made of grain. But whatever its wisdom, the die was cast. The army was on the hill, the cavalry was riding for help, and Caesar's engineers were unrolling their tools. What they were about to build around that plateau would be one of the most astonishing feats of military engineering in all of history. A thing so monstrous and so ingenious that men would study it in wonder for 20 centuries to come. The hill was trapped. The grain was counting down, and the wooden walls were beginning to rise. You stand on the walls of Alesia, beside the trapped war king, looking down as the Roman lines begin to rise, and now you must simply watch in astonishment, because what Caesar's engineers are about to build around this hill is, even after everything you have seen of their genius, almost beyond belief. Remember the nightly camps, the bridge across the Rhine thrown up for sport, the supernatural speed of men who turned construction into a weapon. All of that was a rehearsal. This is the masterpiece. This is the thing that will be studied in wonder for 2,000 years. Here is your anchoring fact, and you should let the sheer scale of it wash over your sleepy mind. Caesar's army built not one wall around Alesia, but two complete rings of fortification, one inside the other, encircling the entire hill. The inner ring, the contravallation, faced inward toward Vercingetorix and his trapped army, designed to keep them penned in and to repel any attempt to break out. The outer ring, the circumvallation, faced outward, away from the hill, built to defend the Romans against the great relief army that everyone knew was coming. Caesar, in other words, prepared to be besieged, and besieger at the same time, his legions sandwiched in a fortified corridor between the trapped enemy within and the gathering host without. The total length of these walls stretched for many miles, the inner ring some 11 miles around the hill, the outer ring longer, still encircling not just an army, but a whole landscape. You walk the length of it in your imagination, and you cannot quite grasp how fast it rose. The accounts say the Romans completed this colossal double ring of fortifications, with ditches, ramparts, palisades, and watchtowers spaced along its entire length in roughly a matter of weeks. Picture that. Tens of miles of military engineering, 2 complete fortress walls facing opposite directions, raised by hand by an army that was at the same time fighting off Gaulish sorties and trying to feed itself in hostile country. Your own modest home improvement projects, the shelf still unmounted, the paint still in the tins, suddenly feel like a profound personal embarrassment. These men built a city-sized fortification trap in the time it takes you to finally return an email. But it was not merely the scale that made it monstrous. It was the fiendish ingenuity of the defences packed into the ground before the walls. And here your quirky tidbit becomes genuinely, gleefully sinister, because Caesar's engineers had a whole nicknamed menagerie of nasty traps. In the killing ground before the ramparts, they dug rows of pits with sharpened stakes hidden at the bottom, concealed under brush, which the soldiers grimly nicknamed lilies, because the deadly points poked up like flowers. They scattered iron spikes and barbs to cripple feet and hooves. They planted lines of sharpened logs and embedded hooked branches, angled to snag and impale anyone charging through. The Romans, with their dark, soldierly humour, gave these horrors almost affectionate pet names, calling some of them by terms meaning spurs and markers and, yes, lilies, as though they were tending a garden rather than seeding a field with mutilation. Imagine the cheerful menace of it, a legionary pointing and saying, "Mind the lilies," and meaning a pit full of stakes. It is the most chilling gardening metaphor in military history. You look down on all this from the walls of Alesia, and you feel the despair settle over the trapped Gauls like a cold fog, because they could see exactly what was happening below them. They watched the walls rise, watched the ditches deepen, watched the lilies bloom in the killing ground, and they understood with terrible clarity that they were being sealed into a tomb of timber and earth, that every passing day the noose drew tighter, and that the only hope left in the whole world was the relief army that had not yet appeared on the horizon. And meanwhile, inside the walls, the clock made of grain ticked on the stores, dwindling 80,000 fighting men, and a town full of civilians slowly, inexorably running out of food. The horror inside Alesia deepened as the days dragged on, and this is the part you must approach gently, because it is the bleakest moment of the whole story. As the grain ran low and starvation crept in, Vercingetorix and his commanders faced an impossible arithmetic: too many mouths and not enough food to last until rescue. The townsfolk who lived in Alesia, the non-combatants, the families, became a terrible burden on the dwindling stores. And so a decision was made that haunts the account to this day. The civilians of the town were sent out, expelled from the walls, in the desperate hope that Caesar would let them pass through his lines to safety, or at least that they would no longer eat the soldiers' grain. But Caesar, with cold strategic logic, refused to let them through his fortifications. And so these people were left stranded in the no-man's land between the town and the Roman walls, unable to go forward, unable to go back, caught in the dead ground between two armies. It is a detail of such quiet horror that you need not dwell on it, only acknowledge it and hold a little compassion for them across the centuries. Here the ground softens for the night. Historians still argue whether the fortifications at Alesia represent the absolute pinnacle of ancient Roman military engineering, an achievement essentially unmatched in the classical world, or whether Caesar, ever the author of his own legend, exaggerated their scale and sophistication in his account to make his eventual victory sound all the more superhuman. Modern excavations at the site have confirmed a great deal of what he described. The ditches, the traps, the lines which lends his account real weight. Yet the precise dimensions and the full grandeur remain a matter of scholarly wrangling. Brilliant beyond doubt, perhaps even more brilliant on the page than in the dirt. But whatever its exact measure, the ring of wood and despair was complete now, the double wall sealed around the hill, the lilies blooming in the killing ground, the grain running out within. Vercingetorix was trapped in a fortress of his enemy's making, and every hope he had left rode on a single distant gamble. Somewhere out across Gaul, the relief army was finally gathering, vast beyond reckoning. And it was beginning at last to march. You stand on the walls of Alesia with the trapped and starving defenders, the lilies blooming below in their killing ground, the grain nearly gone, and you turn your eyes as they turn theirs toward the horizon. Because everything now depends on what may or may not appear there. Remember the cavalry Vercingetorix sent slipping out into the night before the trap closed, galloping across Gaul with desperate orders to every tribe. This is the moment those orders come due. This is the gamble at the heart of his whole plan, the second host, the pincer, the rescue. And as the days drag on and the defenders' bellies hollow, the question that hangs over the hill is simple and unbearable. Will they come, and if they come, will it be in time? Here is your anchoring fact, and its scale is almost difficult to hold in your sleepy mind. Gaul answered the call. The tribes, roused by Vercingetorix's summons, and by the dawning understanding that this hill would decide all their fates together, gathered a relief army of staggering size, a host drawn from across the whole of the country, by the ancient accounts numbering perhaps 250,000 men. Now you should treat that figure with the same healthy skepticism you have learned to apply to all of Caesar's numbers, for he had every reason to inflate the size of the enemy he was about to defeat. But even discounted heavily, even cut to a fraction, this was an enormous army, very likely far larger than Caesar's own force. A vast tide of Gaulish warriors converging on Alesia from every direction to break the siege and crush the Romans against the walls of the town. The patchwork quilt you walked on the very first night had for one final time gathered itself whole. You imagine the moment that host first appears, and the accounts give you something cinematic to hold in the dark. The defenders on the walls of Alesia, half-starved, despairing, scanning the horizon day after day, finally saw it, the relief army cresting the surrounding heights, filling the hills, a multitude so vast it seemed to cover the land. The trapped Gauls, the story goes, erupted in joy at the sight, cheering and weeping on the ramparts, certain that rescue had come at last, that the pincer was closing, that the cold Roman trap was about to be sprung in reverse. For one soaring moment, the arithmetic seemed to flip entirely. Caesar's legions, sandwiched in their fortified corridor between the 80,000 within and the 250,000 without, looked suddenly less like besiegers and more like a small force about to be crushed between two enormous stones. Now your quirky tidbit, and it lives in the strange genius of Caesar's predicament. Caesar had, in building his double wall, essentially predicted this exact moment and prepared for it in advance, which is why he had bothered with that outer ring facing away from the hill. But the situation he now found himself in was so bizarre that it remains almost unique in military history. A besieging army that was itself completely surrounded and besieged, fighting in two opposite directions at once, from within its own fortifications. Picture the sheer absurdity of the geometry. The Gauls inside the ring wanted out, the Gauls outside the ring wanted in, and the Romans, sandwiched in the middle in their corridor of timber and lilies, had to hold both walls simultaneously, fending off attacks from the front and the back like a man trying to defend two doors at once while increasingly low on, you guessed it, that precious grain. Even Caesar's own supplies were running thin, which means all three armies on that hill were to some degree hungry. It was a siege of starvation, in which nearly everyone was starving. You feel the tension wind tighter and tighter as the two Gaulish forces, the trapped and the relieving, tried to coordinate their attacks to strike the inner and outer walls at the same moment and overwhelm the stretched Roman defenders at a single point. The relief army probed the outer fortifications, testing for weakness, while Vercingetorix prepared his own men to sally out against the inner wall the instant their rescuers struck. The whole vast drama balanced now on timing and coordination, on whether two enormous Gaulish hosts, separated by miles of Roman engineering and unable to easily communicate, could land their blows together. And coordination, you will remember from that very first night, had never been the Gauls' great strength. The shouted relay across the fields could spread news, but it could not perfectly synchronize a battle. And here, the despair and the hope braid together into almost unbearable suspense, because everything that Vercingetorix had built, the united tribes, the scorched earth, the victory at Gergovia, the bold gamble of Alesia itself, all of it had narrowed down to this: 2 armies, his own and his rescuers, poised to crush the most dangerous general in history between them. The numbers favoured Gaul. The position favoured Gaul. For the second time in this story, it genuinely truly looked as though Free Gaul might win, as though the War King's improbable dream might come true after all, as though Caesar's legend might end here on a starving hilltop in the heart of the country he had tried to conquer. Here the ground softens for your drowsy mind. Historians still argue whether the relief army was truly as colossal as Caesar claimed, a host of 250,000 that blotted the surrounding hills, or whether the real number was far smaller, dramatically inflated by a general who understood that the bigger the foe he overcame, the brighter his own glory would shine. The honest answer is that we cannot be certain, that the figure rests almost entirely on the word of the man it most flattered. Yet, even the skeptics agree, the relieving force was very large enough to put Caesar in genuine mortal peril, large enough that the outcome of Alesia was for a time truly in doubt. But doubt, as you know, is not the same as victory. The host had come, the hills were full, the pincer was set. And now, with 2 enormous Gaulish armies poised to strike the inner and outer walls at once, with Caesar's stretched legions standing in their corridor of timber and despair, the moment of decision had finally arrived. Everything would be settled in the days that followed, in the most desperate fighting of the entire war, when the walls of Alesia would be tested from both sides at once. You stand in the corridor between the walls now, in that impossible sandwich of timber and lilies, and you brace yourself, because what comes next is the climax of everything, the most desperate fighting of the entire war, the hours upon which 2,000 years of memory would turn. The 2 great Gaulish hosts, the trapped army within and the vast relief force without, gathered themselves for the decisive blow. The plan was simple and terrifying in its potential. Strike both walls at once, the inner and the outer, at the same moment, in the same place if possible, and overwhelm the stretched Roman defenders before they could shift their reserves. Caesar's men would have to be everywhere at once, and no army, however disciplined, can truly be everywhere at once. It was on paper a winning hand. Here is your anchoring fact, the spine of the whole climax. The fighting at Alesia reached its peak in a series of massive coordinated assaults, and the most dangerous of them came when the relief army, having scouted the Roman lines, identified a weak point, a place where the outer wall could not be fully closed because of the lie of the land, a vulnerable seam in Caesar's vast fortifications. They concentrated a powerful force against this weak point, while Vercingetorix simultaneously launched his trapped army out from the town against the inner wall at the corresponding spot. For a few harrowing hours, the Roman defenders at this point were assaulted from both directions at once, the relief force battering the outer rampart, the trapped Gauls clawing at the inner one, the legionaries in between fighting back to back, holding 2 crumbling lines with dwindling numbers and failing strength. This was the moment. If the walls broke here, Caesar was finished, his army split and surrounded and doomed. You feel the chaos of it, the sheer sensory overload, and it is nothing like the cool-ordered camps you toured so many nights ago. There is dust everywhere, and the din of tens of thousands of voices, and the crash of bodies against timber, and the deadly bloom of the lilies, as charging warriors stumble into the hidden pits. The Gauls fought with the desperate courage of people who knew this was their last chance for freedom, hurling themselves at the ramparts, filling the ditches, tearing at the palisades with their hands. The relief army pressed the outer wall so hard that the Roman line there began to buckle and give way. Word raced to Caesar that the weak point was failing, that the defenders there could not hold much longer, that the whole vast trap was about to crack open at its seam. Now here is the image that history fixed forever, and it gives this section its quiet drama. In the crisis, with the walls failing and his lieutenants struggling to hold the line, Caesar himself rode to the threatened point to rally his men, and the accounts make a point of a small but striking detail. He wore a distinctive cloak, a scarlet or crimson cloak, that marked him out, that made him visible across the battlefield, so that his soldiers, glancing back in the dust and terror, could see for themselves that their general had come, that Caesar was here fighting at the very point of greatest danger. There is your quirky tidbit, and it is a study in the theatre of leadership. Whether by design or simply because it was the cloak of his rank, that flash of red in the chaos was worth a fresh legion, a beacon of nerve that steadied the wavering line. The man who wrote his own legend understood that sometimes leadership is as simple as being the one bright, unmissable color when everything else is dust and despair. Imagine rallying an army by essentially being the most visible thing on the field and refusing to fall down. And then came the stroke that decided it all the moment the walls held and the tide turned. Caesar, even in this extremity, kept a reserve of cavalry in hand, and at the critical instant he sent them not to reinforce the wall directly, but on a wide ride around the outside of the battlefield, swinging clear of the fighting to fall upon the rear of the relief army, assaulting the outer rampart. The relieving Gauls, utterly focused on breaking through the wall in front of them, were suddenly struck from behind by Roman horsemen caught between the rampart and the cavalry. Exactly the kind of pincer they had hoped to spring on Caesar, now sprung upon them instead. The shock broke them. The great relief army, so vast it had blotted the surrounding hills, wavered, then cracked, then dissolved into rout, fleeing in every direction across the country, the rescue collapsing in a single terrible afternoon. You turn your eyes to Alesia, to Vercingetorix, watching from the walls, and you feel the moment the hope dies in his chest. From the heights he could see it all, the relief army he had summoned from across Gaul, breaking apart and streaming away his rescuers, scattering to the winds the pincer he had staked everything upon, springing closed on empty air. His own sally against the inner wall had failed too, thrown back into the town. There would be no second host now, no rescue, no reversal. The walls had held, the grain was gone, the relief army was fleeing. And the 80,000 within Alesia who had cheered and wept on the ramparts when their rescuers first crested the hills now understood in a wave of silent horror that they were entirely alone, sealed in a fortress of their enemies' making, with no hope left in all the world. Here the ground softens for your drowsy mind. Historians still argue whether Alesia was won by Caesar's brilliant generalship, that cool decision to hold a reserve and time the cavalry charge perfectly, or whether it was lost by Gaulish failures of coordination, the inability of two enormous armies to land their blows together at the same instant on the same spot. Some credit Roman discipline and Caesar's nerve. Others point to how desperately close it came, how a slightly better timed assault might have cracked the wall and changed everything. The truth, as ever, likely braids both together, a battle nearly lost and narrowly won, balanced on a knife's edge of timing and that one flash of scarlet in the dust. But the walls had held, the relief army was gone, and inside Alesia the last free chief of Gaul faced the most bitter decision a leader can ever make. You stand with Vercingetorix on the walls of Alesia in the terrible quiet that follows the rout, the dust of the fleeing relief army still settling on the distant hills, and you feel the silence press in heavier than any battle din. The cheering is gone, the hope is gone, the grain is gone, and in that silence the war king must do the arithmetic one final time, the cruelest arithmetic of his life, and arrive at the only answer left. There will be no rescue. There will be no breakout, not with his men starving and the double wall intact and the lilies waiting in the killing ground. The 80,000 within these walls have a choice between slow death by hunger and surrender, and he, their leader, must choose for them. Everything he built, the united tribes, the scorched earth, the victory at Gergovia, all of it has narrowed to this single unbearable point. Here is your anchoring fact, and it is the quiet heart of the whole story. Vercingetorix gathered the council of the besieged and offered them a choice that tells you everything about the man. He told them that he had not waged this war for himself, but for the freedom of all Gaul, and that since fortune had turned against them, he would submit himself to their will. They could, he said, either kill him and offer his body to the Romans to appease Caesar, or hand him over alive. It was an act of leadership, rare in any age, a commander who, in the hour of total defeat, did not flee or bargain for his own skin, but offered himself up as the price of his people's survival. He had asked everything of them. Now he offered everything of himself. You watch the surrender unfold, and the accounts give you a scene of immense and sorrowful dignity. The next day the gates of Alesia opened, and Vercingetorix prepared to deliver himself to Caesar. And here, in how exactly it happened, the sources blur into something between history and legend, and you may choose whichever version your sleepy mind finds most fitting. In one telling, the plainer one, he was simply handed over by his people, the weapons of the defenders, laid down the great rebellion, ending in weary submission. But in another more dramatic telling, the one that history fell in love with, Vercingetorix dressed himself in his finest armour, mounted his finest horse, and rode out alone from the gates of Alesia. He galloped a circle around Caesar, seated in state before his fortifications, then dismounted, stripped off his armour and his weapons, and sat down in silence at the Roman general's feet, surrendering without a single word. Now your quirky tidbit lives precisely in that silence and that drama, because it reveals how stories grow taller in the retelling. That vivid image, the proud chief riding a circle and casting down his arms in theatrical defiance, comes to us mainly from later Roman writers, not from Caesar's own account, which describes the surrender far more flatly and briefly. Caesar, oddly, did not dwell on this climactic moment, his greatest triumph of the whole war, devoting only a sentence or two to it. Imagine that. The defeat of his most dangerous enemy, the end of the Great Rebellion, and the master self-promoter barely mentions it, while later writers centuries on dressed the scene in armour and gave it the grand cinematic surrender. Remember, it is a perfect little lesson in how history works, the bare fact from one pen, the unforgettable image painted by others long after. The truest version may be the dullest, and the version we cherish may be the most embroidered. You feel the weight of that moment, however it truly happened, the war king sitting weaponless at the feet of the conqueror, and you understand that something larger than one man's surrender is ending here. This is the end of free Gaul. Not just a battle lost or a town fallen, but the final extinguishing of the Great Rebellion, the last serious attempt by the Gaulish peoples to throw off Rome and remain masters of their own land. The patchwork quilt you walked on that first night, the squabbling tribes, the sacred groves, the barrel rollers and the bards, all of it now passes definitively under the Roman eagles. Vercingetorix had united the untable and come within a hair's breadth of victory twice. And in the end, the fragile alliance, the failed cavalry gamble, the trap at Alesia and Caesar's cold engineering genius had been enough to tip the scales the other way. And the mercy he hoped to buy with his surrender, it came partly and at a terrible price. The accounts say that Caesar spared a great many of the surrendered defenders, but he distributed them as slaves, handing one captive to each of his soldiers as plunder the spoils of the war flowing south one final time. Some tribes were treated more leniently for political reasons, allies to be cultivated rather than crushed. But the great army within Alesia, the gathered might of the rebellion, was scattered into bondage or sent home broken, and the war king himself was bound and led away, kept alive, you will soon learn, for a far grimmer purpose than a quick death. Here the ground softens for your drowsy mind. Historians still argue whether the dramatic surrender scene, the circling horse, and the silent casting down of arms ever truly happened, or whether it is a noble fiction invented by later writers to give the fall of Gaul the tragic grandeur it seemed to deserve. Some defend the image as plausible, drawn from real Gaulish customs of submission. Others dismiss it as pure romance layered onto Caesar's terse original by storytellers who wanted a hero worthy of the moment. We will likely never know which silence truly fell that day, the theatrical one or the plain one. But fall it did, one way or another. The weapons were down. The eagles stood over Alesia, And the last free chief of Gaul, his rebellion ended, his people scattered, his freedom gone, was led away in chains toward a long darkness, and a fate that would keep him waiting in the cold for years before Rome was finished with him. You follow the chained war king, away from the silent walls of Alesia, away from the eagles and the scattered host, and the journey carries you south, now the green hills of Gaul falling behind over the mountains, down at last into the green, great stone city of Rome itself. And here the story does something cruel and strange. It stops. For Vercingetorix, the man who united the untable and twice nearly beat the greatest general alive, time simply halts, and you must sit with him in the halting, in the long darkness that follows, because what Rome did with its most famous captive was not to kill Tim and not to free him, but to do nothing at all for years. Here is your anchoring fact, and it is a quiet horror all its own. Vercingetorix was not executed after his surrender, nor ransomed nor sent into exile. He was imprisoned in Rome, held in captivity for roughly 6 years, kept alive and kept hidden, preserved like a trophy in a drawer waiting. And the reason for this long, deliberate waiting tells you something chilling about Roman power. He was being saved. A Roman general who won a great war was entitled, if the Senate granted it, to a triumph, an enormous public victory parade through the streets of Rome, and the centerpiece of such a parade, its greatest prize, was a captured enemy leader, displayed in chains before the cheering crowds. Vercingetorix was to be that centerpiece. But Caesar could not hold his triumph yet, for he was busy first with the rest of the Gallic War, then with the great civil war that would consume Rome itself. And so his most valuable captive simply had to wait in a cell until his conqueror was ready to show him off. You sit with him in that darkness, and the imagination strains to fill it, because the sources tell you almost nothing about these years. 6 years. Picture the span of it. A man who had ridden across burning Gaul, rallying the tribes, who had stood on the heights of Gergovia in triumph, who had commanded 80,000 men, now reduced to a single figure in a Roman cell. Watching the light move across a wall, season after season, year after year, forgotten by the world outside, kept breathing for no reason other than to one day be paraded and then disposed of. There is a particular cruelty in it, this preservation without purpose, this being kept alive precisely so that one's eventual death can be made into a public entertainment. He was not a prisoner, so much as a stored object, a thing set aside for later use. Now your quirky tidbit, and it is grim but illuminating, for it concerns the place where such captives were likely held. Rome had a notorious prison near the heart of the city, an ancient and dreadful place, and its lowest chamber was a dark, cramped underground cell, reached only by a hole in the ceiling, into which prisoners of state were lowered, and from which, very often, they did not emerge alive. This grim pit was where Rome traditionally kept and disposed of its most significant captives, the defeated kings and chiefs reserved for the climax of a triumph. The detail to hold tonight is the sheer practical bleakness of it, a dungeon you entered by being dropped through a hole, a place whose very architecture announced that you were not meant to come back up. It is a far cry from the green, sacred groves and the firelit halls where this story began, and the contrast is the whole tragedy in miniature, the free sun of the highlands, ending in a hole in the ground beneath a foreign city. You feel the strange weight of those vanished years, and you understand that this is in its quiet way one of the most poignant parts of the entire story, precisely because so little of it survives. We have vivid accounts of the battles, the sieges, the surrender, the great public drama, but of the 6 years in the cell, the long, slow heart of the man's suffering history left us almost nothing, just the bare fact that he waited and waited while the world moved on without him. Caesar fought his civil war, crossed his famous river, made himself master of Rome, accumulated power beyond any republican's dreams. And all the while, in a cell not far from the seat of that power, the last free chief of Gaul sat in the dark, a forgotten footnote to his conqueror's rise, kept alive for a parade that kept being postponed. There is something almost unbearable in imagining what those years did to a man like him, though you must be careful, for you are imagining, not recording. Did he hold on to hope in the early months? that some turn of fortune might free him? Did that hope curdle year by year into resignation and then into something quieter still? Did news of Caesar's growing power filter down into his cell? The knowledge that the man who beat him was now the most powerful person in the world, that the cause for which Gaul had bled was now utterly, finally lost, we cannot know. The darkness of that cell swallowed not only the man but the record of him, and we are left only with the duration, the cruel arithmetic of 6 years to measure a suffering we cannot otherwise see. Here the ground softens for your drowsy mind. Historians still argue over the exact conditions and even the precise length of his captivity, for the sources are frustratingly thin and not entirely consistent, some details inferred from Roman custom rather than recorded from observation. We are reasonably sure he was held for years awaiting Caesar's triumph, but the texture of those years, the where and the how and the what it was like, rests largely on reconstruction from what we know of Roman practice with other captive leaders. The man at the very center of one of history's great stories spent his final years in a silence so complete that even his suffering must be imagined rather than known. But the waiting, however dark, was not endless. At last, Caesar's wars were won, his power secured, and the time came to hold the great triumph. He had earned the dazzling parade through the streets of Rome that would display his conquests to the roaring crowds. And the centerpiece, the prize captive saved so carefully through all those years in the dark, would finally be brought up into the light for one last and terrible appearance. You wait in the dark of that cell with the forgotten chief, the 6 silent years pressing down, and at last the door opens and the light comes flooding in, but it brings no rescue, only the final act. Caesar's wars are won. His power is secure. He is now the master of Rome, and the time has come for him to celebrate the triumph he has earned. The great victory parade through the streets of the city, and the prize that has been kept so carefully in the dark through all these years is to be brought up into the light, at last, for one final and terrible appearance before the roaring crowds. Here is your anchoring fact, the grim climax of the captive's long story. In the year that Caesar held his magnificent quadruple triumph, celebrating his many conquests, Vercingetorix was brought out and paraded through the streets of Rome as the captive centerpiece of the Gallic portion of the spectacle. Picture the scene and feel the full weight of the humiliation. The streets packed with cheering Romans, the spoils of conquered Gaul carried past the gold and the captives, and the painted images of distant battles, and there led in chains before the crowds the man who had once united all of Gaul, twice nearly destroyed Caesar himself, now displayed as a defeated trophy, a living symbol of Rome's mastery over the northern tribes. He who had ridden across burning country rallying a nation was reduced to a spectacle, a thing to be gawked at, and jeered the human prize at the heart of his conqueror's greatest day. And then comes the end, and you must brace yourself, for it is brutal in its cold finality. The Roman triumph followed an ancient and merciless custom. After the captive enemy leader had been displayed, and the parade had wound its way to its conclusion, at the temple atop the great hill, the prisoner was led away to that dreadful underground prison you glimpsed last night. The dark pit entered through a hole in the ceiling, and there, while the triumph's feasting and celebration carried on above Vercingetorix, was executed, put to death by strangulation, in the darkness of that cell. His life ended quietly and without ceremony, at the very moment his conqueror stood at the summit of his glory. The contrast is the whole cruelty of it laid bare. The roar of the crowd above, the silent killing below, the triumph, and the throttling happening almost in the same breath. You sit with the bleakness of that, and your quirky tidbit tonight is a sorrowful and revealing one rather than a charming one. For all the importance history would later place upon Vercingetorix, for all that he would one day become a towering national symbol, the Roman sources record his death with a startling, almost offhand brevity. The man's execution, the end of the last free chief of Gaul, the climax of one of the great resistance stories of the ancient world, merited barely a passing mention in the accounts of the day. To the Romans he was simply one more defeated barbarian leader, meeting the customary fate, a routine item in the program of a triumph, no more remarkable than the disposal of any other captive king. The detail to hold is that searing indifference, the way the people who killed him saw nothing momentous in it at all, while 2,000 years later, the whole world would remember the name they barely bothered to record. There is a strange and bitter justice in that reversal, the conquerors forgetting the conquered remembered. You feel the finality settle over the whole story because this is truly the end of free Gaul, sealed now not on a battlefield but in a prison cell. The rebellion was crushed at Alesia, but the man and the dream lingered on in that captivity, and only here, with the strangling in the dark, is the last thread finally cut. Vercingetorix dies, and with him dies the last serious hope of Gaulish independence, the country passing fully and finally into the Roman world, where it would remain for centuries. Its tribes Romanized, its old gods, fading, its sacred groves cut down, its bards falling silent, until the free patchwork land you walked on that very first night existed only in memory and in the cold pages of the conqueror's own account. And there is one last cruel irony to sit with as the man dies. Caesar, standing at the summit of his power on the day of that triumph, had only a short time left himself. Within a couple of years, the conqueror would be struck down by his own people, assassinated in the Senate. His life ended as abruptly and violently as the captives, though far more famously, the two men, conqueror and conquered, bound together by that war in Gaul, would both meet violent ends within a few short years of one another. The one strangled quietly in a pit, the other stabbed publicly in a hall, and history would remember them forever. As a pair, the great general and the great rebel locked together in the same unforgettable story. Here the ground softens for your drowsy mind. Historians still argue over the precise details of his execution, and even its exact timing, for the sources, as ever, are sparing with the man they killed, and some of what we believe rests on the known customs of the Roman triumph, rather than on direct record of his particular death. We are confident he was paraded and then executed at the conclusion of Caesar's triumph in the traditional manner. But the finer texture of those final hours, like so much of his captivity, must be reconstructed from what Rome usually did, rather than from what was carefully written down about him, specifically. Even in death, the walking slips half into shadow. But however it precisely unfolded, the end was the same. The parade, the pit, the silent strangling, the conqueror's glory above, and the rebel's death below. Vercingetorix was gone, erased so quietly that his killers scarcely noted it, and for centuries afterward he would lie largely forgotten, a minor figure in someone else's war, his name surviving mainly in the pages of the very man who had defeated him. Yet history was not finished with him, for the strange and beautiful truth is that the man Rome erased without ceremony would one day rise again, not in flesh, but in legend, reborn in bronze and stone as the eternal symbol of a freedom that long outlived the empire that crushed it. You leave the silent pit beneath Rome, the strangled chief erased without ceremony, and now the journey does something wonderful, something that lifts you up out of the darkness at last. It leaps forward across the centuries, past the fall of the very empire that killed him, past the long forgetting, and into an age that would resurrect the man Rome had so casually disposed of. Because here is the strange and beautiful truth you have been waiting for, the redemption hidden at the end of this long tragedy. The conqueror won the war, but the conquered won the memory. Vercingetorix, strangled in the dark and barely noted by his killers, would one day stand taller in the imagination of the world than Caesar ever managed, reborn not in flesh, but in legend, in bronze and in stone, as the eternal symbol of a freedom that outlasted the empire that crushed it. Here is your anchoring fact, the one that completes the whole circle. For the better part of 2,000 years, Vercingetorix was indeed largely forgotten, a minor figure, surviving mostly in the pages of Caesar's own account, the very book written by the man who beat him. But in the 1800s, in the France that had grown up on the soil of ancient Gaul, he was rediscovered and embraced with extraordinary passion, transformed into a national hero, the first great champion of French freedom, the original ancestor figure of the nation, a man who had dared to unite the tribes and stand against a foreign conqueror. A French emperor of that century, fascinated by the story, sponsored archaeological digs at the very sites of the war, helped pin down where Alesia had stood, and commissioned an enormous statue of the War King to be raised on the hill where he had made his final stand. The forgotten captive became at last a colossus. You picture that statue standing on the heights, and it gives you a closing image to hold against all the darkness you have walked through. There on the very ground where the double walls once rose, and the lilies bloomed, and the relief army scattered, stands a towering bronze figure of Vercingetorix, gazing out over the landscape of his defeat, transformed now into a monument of defiance and dignity. The man who sat weaponless at Caesar's feet, who waited 6 years in a cell, who was strangled in a pit and forgotten, now looms in metal over the country that claimed him as its founding hero. The place of his greatest catastrophe became the place of his greatest glory and the freedom he failed to win in life. He came to embody forever in legend. There is your redemption, the long arc, bending at last towards something like justice. Now your quirky tidbit, and it is a delightful one to send you off smiling. That grand statue raised in the 1800s was shaped, the story goes, with a face that bore a curious resemblance to the very emperor who commissioned it, so that the ancient Gaulish chief ended up looking rather a lot like the modern French ruler who wanted to associate himself with the hero's glory. And beyond the statue, Vercingetorix would go on to a second life so vast it would have baffled the Romans entirely, becoming a fixture of French schoolbooks, of paintings and novels and films, and even in a gloriously cheeky modern echo, the clear inspiration for the beloved comic book Gauls, who endlessly outwit their Roman occupiers, the mustachioed villagers brewing magic potion in their little holdout against the empire. The defeated chief became of all things a source of national comedy and pride, his tragedy transmuted into folk heroism and even laughter. Imagine the Roman who barely bothered to record his death, learning that 2,000 years on children would dress as his people for fun. History keeps the strangest accounts of all. You sit now with the full shape of the story, the whole long arc of it, and you understand why it endures. Vercingetorix lost. That is the plain fact at the center of everything. He lost the war, lost his freedom, lost his life in a dark cell beneath a foreign city. And yet, he is remembered, cherished, immortalized, precisely because of how he lost, because he came so close, because he united the ununitable and twice nearly toppled the greatest general in history, because in the hour of total defeat he offered up his own life to spare his people, because he embodied a freedom worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. The world, you realize, does not only remember its victors. Sometimes it reserves its deepest love for the ones who lost magnificently, who reached for something glorious and fell just short, who became in their very failure immortal. Here the ground softens one final time. Historians still argue whether the modern image of Vercingetorix, the noble freedom fighter, the founding father of a nation, the proto-French patriot, bears much real resemblance to the actual Gaulish war chief who lived and died so long ago, or whether he is largely a romantic invention, a figure reshaped and reimagined by later ages to serve their own needs for heroes and origins. The real man, after all, fought for Gaul, not for France, a country that would not exist for many centuries, and his true aims and character remain half hidden behind Caesar's self-serving account and the embroidery of legend. Perhaps the Vercingetorix we cherish is as much a creation of the 1800s as of the ancient world. But perhaps in the end, that hardly matters, for a symbol does its work regardless of how perfectly it matches the man. And so the last free Gaul, defeated and erased, rose again as legend, and stands to this day in bronze upon his hill, gazing out over the land he failed to save, and yet in failing came to represent forever. The chief who almost defeated Julius Caesar lost his war, but he won something stranger and more lasting, a place in the memory of the world that no conqueror's triumph could ever erase. And on that note, with the War King standing eternal on his height and the empire that killed him long since crumbled to dust, the story comes gently to its close. Now let the scene begin to soften and fade. The hill of Alesia, which you have climbed so many times tonight, grows quiet at last. The great walls long since rotted back into the earth. The lilies gone, the ditches filled, the screaming and the dust all settled into deep green. Silence. The fires that once burned across Gaul have cooled to nothing. The smoke long cleared from a sky that is calm now and darkening and kind. Far below the bronze figure on his hilltop, the rivers that once ringed the fortress flow, slow and untroubled in the gathering dusk, carrying the last light of a day, 2,000 years, gone gently out toward a sea that has forgotten every battle. The cheering crowds have all gone home. The legions have marched off into the dark of history and lain down at last. And the chief himself, strangled so long ago in his cell, rests now beyond all reach of harm. His suffering over his long waiting ended, his story told and finished and laid to rest. There is nothing left to fear in any of it, for it is all so very long ago, all of it past, all of it quiet. The proud tribes and the cold legions, the conqueror and the captive, the burning towns and the silent groves, all of them are sleeping now, folded away safely into the deep, soft dark of the past, where nothing can trouble them and nothing can trouble you. The world has gone still. The stars are dimming one by one above the quiet hill. And it is time now for you to let go of the long ago, to sink down into your own warm and gentle dark and to sleep. Rest easy. All is quiet. All is well. Sleep now, and sweet dreams.